So it just so happens that as we conclude this leg of the season with an episode about Tolstoy's view of art, I'm releasing some art of my own. I've got a new single out today called Together Forever with my band Slumbering Sun. I've got a link in the description. Head on over to Invisible Oranges and give it a listen. Thanks. Leo Tolstoy is one of the most famous writers of all time and is primarily known as a great novelist. He had a long life, he had a productive and life-spanning career in writing fiction. He gave us classics such as War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But when Tolstoy was in his 50s, he began a side project, if you will, in writing philosophical essays. This side of Tolstoy is not as well known, and yet in the course of his philosophical work, he managed something quite incredible, in that he arguably finds some new approaches to some very old philosophical questions. And that's uncommon even among philosophers. And what is perhaps even more remarkable is that Tolstoy's profoundest philosophical insights, in my opinion anyway, are insights into the activity of art. By the time Tolstoy finished his essay What is Art in the year 1904, he was a very old man at 76 years old. All of his major works were written in the decades beforehand by this point in his life, meaning that, as with most or even almost all artists, Tolstoy apparently had no problem making art, even great art, without first coming to some intellectual understanding of what he was doing. But it is only within such a mind, the mind of someone who is both creative and artistic, as well as pensive and prone to examination of oneself and one's own ideas. Within that kind of mind, we might expect to find such a wealth of insights on art, because usually the philosophers are too unartistic and the artists are too unself-reflective. Tolstoy is, in other words, one of the few authorities that one might look to in terms of his artistic ability, in order to perceive what truly great art is, and somebody who actually ventured to ask the question, what is art? What am I doing? What is the process of art? What is the meaning of art? All too often, the philosophical minds who address themselves to that question come to conclusions which seem overly abstract or are otherwise divorced from the real understanding of the artistic process. So often, the philosopher examines art from the perspective of the effect that the art has, or he considers it from the perspective of utility, or from his own concept of the good, or according to a metaphysical conception of beauty, which is, as Tolstoy charges, almost entirely invented within his own mind. And in other words, oftentimes the philosophical minds just end up looking at art as if from the outside in, with no real insight into the inner activity that fires the creative process. So today we're going to consider Tolstoy's essay, What is Art?, which is my favorite of Tolstoy's essays, and one which was heavily influential on me and my own view of art. Although I should say, I came to many of my conclusions regarding art independently of Tolstoy. But it was when I was writing my book and researching what past thinkers had said about art and its meaning that I dove deeply into Tolstoy's essay. And I found almost everything he had to say was very much in keeping with my own insights and intuitions on the subject, and in many important ways he sparked new insights for me that I had never really considered. It was just one of those remarkable moments in which learning really did seem like remembering, as Plato argued, because Tolstoy's words seemed to immediately ring true, and not as a way of looking at art that seemed foreign to me, but that I was only now understanding, but it was like something that I had already known, but never been able to articulate in the way that Tolstoy could. And that's part of why I love this essay so much. So, what is art? While Tolstoy admits that we can, matter-of-factly say it is paintings, it is sculptures, it's architecture, it's plays, and so on, that answer doesn't really get us anywhere. It doesn't tell us what it is that unites all of these things as art. And it does not tell us how to tell good art from bad art, which, in some sense, that question is indistinguishable from the question of what art is for, or what the meaning of art is, because how could you tell which art is good art if you don't know what art is aimed at? We can see the artfulness that may be involved in erecting a building, and yet some buildings are merely functional. whereas others are said to rise to the level of fine architecture. Why is that? What is the difference? I mean, there can surely be a sense of artistry involved in even something that's not generally considered among the fine arts, like cooking, but certainly not in all cooking. There's a difference between a meal that's prepared with care and attention to detail and aesthetic presentation and, just a plain meal that you make just for sustenance with none of those considerations involved. And so Tolstoy says that on either side of art, to speak metaphorically, to speak spatially, we have mere functionality on the one side, and then we have failed attempts at art on the other side. The creative productions that do not venture far enough, that do not include enough artfulness, whatever that might mean, and then those which venture too far into excess or into bad taste. And somewhere in the middle is this thing called art, or true art. And even though we can supposedly find it in all sorts of human endeavors, we could also potentially find it in none of them. And so it seems that none of the matter-of-fact answers on this subject, given by the layman or even by the aficionado, really explain what the essential meaning of art is, why we find it valuable, what it does for mankind. And so we have no firm ground to stand on in determining where art ends and begins. And the question, what is art, remains as mystical to us as it has to hundreds or even thousands of years of humanity. And that's no excuse not to answer the question, Tolstoy argues, because art is something that comes with a cost, like all areas of human endeavor, all areas of striving towards which we sacrifice our time, our money, or even human lives. He begins the second part of the essay by posing to us the critical question at the heart of his inquiry, for which the essay is named. He writes, quote, "For the production of every ballet, circus, opera, operetta, exhibition, picture, concert, or printed book, the intense and unwilling labor of thousands and thousands of people is needed at what is often harmful and humiliating work. It were well if artists made all they require for themselves, but as it is, they all need the help of workmen, not only to produce art, but also for their own, usually luxurious maintenance. And one way or other they get it, either through payments from rich people, or through subsidies given by government, in Russia, for instance, in grants of millions of rubles to theaters, conservatories, and academies. This money is collected from the people, some of whom have to sell their only cow to pay the tax, and who never get those aesthetic pleasures which art gives. It was all very well for a Greek or Roman artist, or even for a Russian artist of the first half of our century, when there were still slaves, and it was considered right that there should be, with a quiet mind to make people serve him and his art. But in our day, when in all men there is at least some dim perception of the equal rights of all, it is impossible to constrain people to labor unwillingly for art, without first deciding the question whether it is true that art is so good and so important an affair as to redeem this evil. If not, we have the terrible probability to consider that while fearful sacrifices of the labor and lives of men and of morality itself are being made to art, that same art may be not only useless, but even harmful. And therefore it is necessary for a society in which works of art arise and are supported to find out whether all that professes to be art is really art, whether, as is presupposed in our society, all that which is art is good, and whether it is important and worth those sacrifices which it necessitates. What is this art which is considered so important and necessary for humanity that for its sake these sacrifices of labor, of human life, and even of goodness may be made?" End quote. This is interesting because a similar point is made by Nietzsche insofar as Nietzsche recognizes art, beauty, and the ability to unleash one's own creative potential without being aimed at pure functionality or at, not creativity towards providing one's sustenance or just the maintenance of their house and their affairs, right? But true creativity without any sort of pragmatic end attached to it. Nietzsche recognizes all of this as something that occurs in leisure, and of course it would be. I mean, here by leisure, we don't mean idleness necessarily, although that is included Leisure here really means the ability to use one's time as one likes, rather than the compulsion or the dictate that you have to use your time and labor on behalf of others or in order to merely subsist. And beauty is created by those, in Nietzsche's view, who have been freed from that need to labor on behalf of their own subsistence, or to labor on the behalf of the subsistence of others, even, at least to whatever degree, right? That person who has some degree of leisure time. In other words, a slave isn't doing art because they have no leisure time at all, but the aristocrat for whom others labor has nothing but leisure time. There was more leisure time for the serf, perhaps, although his way of life was by nature hard and exhausting, so it's probably unlikely that many feudal serfs would have the energy to write a novel like War and Peace in between sowing and reaping and so on, though I guess it's not impossible. And most of them weren't literate anyway. And then when we get to the 19th century laborer in the factory, they possess, at least potentially, even more time to themselves, and they have access to even more opportunities, such as the opportunity to become literate or to acquire the skills needed to make art. And there are plenty of examples in the modern world of artists and writers who work full-time jobs and in their spare time are able to be creative. And some of them even produce works that are so successful that it elevates them out of that position of having to labor for their own subsistence. They can simply do art for their own subsistence. But the point being is that you have to create that space where there is free time that is not dedicated to simply sustaining yourself. Even as that may all seem like progress, someone like Nietzsche or Tolstoy will come along and say, certainly, yes, the modern worker has more leisure time, and yet the very prospect of making art will always include this element of what Nietzsche would have called parasitism. That is to say, that for the film director's vision to be realized, millions of dollars have to be spent paying laborers. So while the director gets to be an artist, and the screenwriter, I guess, does, and the actors do, but you need to have people who work as cameramen and soundmen and grips and set designers and costume designers and hair and makeup and lighting. And then you need to feed all these people every day. So you need craft services, and then you need security for the film lot. And then you need accountants to manage and track all of your expenses. You need ads and PR, and it's just endless. And there might be some art involved in any or all of these tasks. Maybe, maybe not. We still haven't defined art. But the functionality of the set is what the man building the set is aimed at, not his own personal artistic expression. He's realizing the expression of someone else. This is very obvious with such large productions, but even when it comes to something like putting out a musical album in the modern world, where it's easier and more accessible than ever to do so, but if you want to make physical copies, you hire a plant, worked by who knows how many laborers, to produce your CDs or press your vinyl. You hire public relations, you hire graphic designers, photographers, videographers. Again, people who involve art in what they're doing but constrain their vision to bring forth your vision. And a touring band, at the mid and higher levels often have to hire a driver and a sound guy and a guitar tech, someone to sell merchandise. And every point in the economy that even like a small underground band intersects with, every time they fill up their gas tank, stay at a hotel, eat at a restaurant, they're paying other people out of their own funds to facilitate their quest to make art in a live setting every night. And regular listeners of the show will know I've done this. I'm describing my own life here. Now, is this naturally parasitical and exploitative? Maybe we don't want to give it that kind of negative connotation, right? But the simple fact is, we can at least make a distinction between what we'd call productive labor, something like that. Labor which facilitates our survival, or facilitates the basic needs of humanity, the essential functions of society. And then there's what we might call the labor of leisure, the labor which is a luxury, the labor which is artistic or creative and effectively useless or doesn't have to turn a profit, that comes out of abundance, a pre-existing abundance. And the simple fact is that that kind of labor can only exist within a social reality in which the productive labor is being done, frankly, by other people. And this applies to the enjoyment of art to some extent as well. We might say that for many people, we work all day so that we can have the pleasure, the enjoyment of winding down and watching television or reading or listening to some music, doing some other activity of leisure that was usually created by someone, again, not doing that productive, essential labor. And so there's this relationship where art is the surplus of a productive economy. It's enjoyed during the time in which we have leisure, and it's created by those who are freed to whatever degree from the need to do productive or sustaining labor. But whereas somebody like Nietzsche would say, good, what is the problem with that, right? Life is exploitative. People should labor for others so that leisure time and art and beauty can exist. Such an answer would not be satisfying to Tolstoy. Tolstoy is, after all, a Christian. And Tolstoy is someone who, like most people on Earth, has perhaps more of a sense than Nietzsche does that there is a brotherhood among mankind. So for Tolstoy, the work and the effort and the labor and sacrifices of others that goes into art presents itself as a problem. Art has to justify itself, so to speak, in light of the fact that it does require the labor of others. This is an evil, as Tolstoy puts it, that art has to answer for, and the artist must make a case that his art in some way cancels or remedies or makes good this evil. We have to come to some sort of understanding of what the value is of art, or the function of art, beyond the mere luxury of a privileged class or beyond mere subjective pleasure or enjoyment, because those types of answers do not justify the evil that goes into creating art, in Tolstoy's view. In Chapter 3 of What is Art, Tolstoy gives us a long tour of all of the explanations that have been written about art and about the nature of beauty, and he does this mostly covering the modern period of philosophical thought. He says he isn't going to talk in this section about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus, all the classical understandings of art, because these minds did not yet make a distinction between the good and the beautiful, which is essential in his view for really understanding art. Whether Tolstoy is right about that is certainly up for debate, but that's what he says. The relationship of art to beauty is also a troublesome one, as we learn in this chapter. As Tolstoy points out, in Russian, the word beautiful really only applies to what you see with your eyes. And while in recent parlance it's become popular in Russian to say things like a beautiful song or an ugly deed, this is, in essence, bad Russian, he says. It's an imported use for the word beautiful from other languages, such as German. The reason I'm bringing in this detail is because it elucidates something about beauty that distinguishes it from art. Beauty is a sense experience, whereas art is an activity. And while it may seem simple enough to say that art is the activity that creates beauty, the simple fact is that not all art does attempt to create beauty. Again, to lean on Nietzsche a bit, Nietzsche says that the Greeks in their tragedies had a predilection for experiencing the grotesque and horrifying side of existence. Now, there is a kind of morbid beauty, I'll admit, in the lines of Clytemnestra, describing how her husband's blood fell upon her like the spring rains that nourish the flowers in the fields, or however she puts it. But the scene in context is terrifying, and it's a bit disgusting in some ways. And meanwhile, we can call a scene out of nature beautiful, which is something that no human hand whatsoever was involved in creating. There was no activity of art involved. So clearly they can be separated. And so, in spite of the fact that the philosophers of the Enlightenment may have been able to make that distinction between beauty and the good, which Tolstoy says is sort of like a prerequisite for really being able to think about art at all, perhaps their conflation of beauty with the activity of art was simply another sort of blurry, unsober approach to the question, what is art? And it's another sort of conflation that we now have to overcome. So when Baumgarten, the first figure that Tolstoy mentions, asserts that beauty is, quote, an order of the parts and their mutual relations to each other and in their relation to the whole, end quote. If we were to take that definition seriously, we would come to a rather intellectualized and, Tolstoy would say, unhelpful definition of art, in which the artistic endeavor is characterized by trying to maintain some sort of harmonious relationship between individual parts, which we might say sounds good as a definition, but it doesn't really tell us anything about art specifically. And we could make the same statement about, as Robert Pirsig points out, motorcycle maintenance, right? Which I guess is an art according to Pirsig. But I think you get the idea that that's a very functional thing, That's looking at art again. It strikes us as a definition arrived at looking from the outside in, or looking at art as if it is the activity that creates beauty. What is beauty? It's this harmonious relationship. Or to jump ahead a little bit, where Tolstoy summarizes Hegel, this is what he says about Hegel's position, quote, "God manifests himself in nature and in art in the form of beauty. God expresses himself in two ways, in the object and in the subject, in nature and in spirit. Beauty is the shining of the idea through matter. Only the soul in what pertains to it is truly beautiful, and therefore the beauty of nature is only the reflection of the natural beauty of the spirit," end quote. And we might ask, when it comes to this definition, does this definition really tell us anything about art? Or is it telling us more? Is it like a reflection of Hegel's philosophical ideas? In other words, would one ever come to such a conclusion about art from creating it or from engaging with it? Or would they have to read Hegel in order to come up with such a definition? And how does Hegel deal with the forms of art that do not involve themselves with that sort of expression of the idea through matter, that involve themselves with the grotesque, or which do not seem to reflect the spiritual beauty of the soul? Would he say that this fails at being art? Tolstoy does an excellent job of sort of briefly summarizing each position on the nature of beauty from pretty much every major philosopher and even many minor figures, and he often does so in only a sentence or two. And while his list may not be exhaustive, it certainly feels as though he elucidates the main contours of development of the Western thought on art, at least a rough outline, a rough sketch. And Tolstoy eventually concludes that, quote, "There are, and it could not be otherwise, only two definitions of beauty. The one objective, mystical, merging this conception into that of the highest perfection, God, a fantastic definition founded on nothing. The other, on the contrary, a very simple and intelligible subjective one, which considers beauty to be that which pleases. I do not add to the word pleases the words without the aim of advantage, because pleases naturally presupposes the absence of the idea of profit. On the one hand, beauty is viewed as something mystical and very elevated, but unfortunately at the same time very indefinite, and consequently embracing philosophy, religion, and life itself, as in the theories of Schelling and Hegel and their German and French followers. Or, on the other hand, as necessarily follows from the definition of Kant and his adherents, beauty is simply a certain kind of disinterested pleasure received by us. And this conception of beauty, although it seems very clear, is unfortunately again inexact, for it widens out on the other side, i.e., it includes the pleasure derived from drink, from food, from touching a delicate skin, etc." End quote. So, broadly speaking, from all those definitions, all of this exploration in the modern age of what beauty is, and thus what constitutes the main activity of art, because there is this conflation going on, at least in Tolstoy's estimation, there are still only really two definitions of beauty, and it could not be otherwise, as he says. What does Tolstoy mean by that? Well, on the one hand, we have those definitions of beauty, those attempts to get at it philosophically by defining beauty, categorizing beauty, trying to grab hold of it in terms of the idea of beauty. These are the views of art that elevate it into a sort of a metaphysical realm, that account for beauty not by recourse to the physical or to the natural, but to some explanation like God, or perhaps the notion that art reflects an idea. These definitions strike Tolstoy as sort of given from the clouds of abstraction. And on the other hand, we have this view of beauty that comes to us, Tolstoy later says, primarily through the English, but they have their forerunner in Kant, which is a more empirical and practical way of looking at things. And arguably, it's more akin to the common sense, sort of matter-of-fact view of how we would answer the question, what is art? That beauty is simply that which pleases. That art is created to give us beauty, which is to say, to give us a kind of pleasure, which is outside of or beyond advantage, beyond sustenance, beyond productivity, pleasure in itself that doesn't lead to anything else. As Tolstoy adds, all true pleasure really is. And we might say it's just sort of leisurely enjoyment, as we've talked about before. And so the first class of approaches to the question, what is art, we could put in the camp of, the idealists, or we might say that the ivory tower, the abstract thinkers who try to make art conform to their metaphysics. It's the pure philosopher's version of art. It's the intellectual attempt at understanding beauty. And we might say the second definition is more pragmatic. It's closer to how the average person sees things. And as Tolstoy says, it's more subjective. And it's more immediately intelligible because of that, but it simply concerns itself with, again, subjective pleasure. And ultimately, Tolstoy thinks that both these approaches fail or are unsatisfying in some way or another. Quote, "It would seem only natural that the science of art should decline to content itself with a definition of art based on beauty, i.e. on that which pleases, and seek a general definition which should apply to all artistic productions, and by reference to which we might decide whether a certain article belong to the realm of art or not. But no such definition is supplied, as the reader may see from those summaries of the aesthetic theories which I have given, and as he may discover even more clearly from the original aesthetic works, if he will be at the pains to read them. All attempts to define absolute beauty in itself, whether as an imitation of nature, or as suitability to its object, or as a correspondence of parts, or as a symmetry, or as harmony, or as unity and variety, etc., either define nothing at all, or define only some traits of some artistic productions, and are far from including all that everybody has always held, and still holds, to be art." End quote. Further down, he continues, quote, "In order to define any human activity, it is necessary to understand its sense and importance, and in order to do that, it is primarily necessary to examine that activity in itself, in its dependence on its causes, and in connection with its effects, and not merely in relation to the pleasure we can get from it. If we say that the aim of any activity is merely our pleasure and define it solely by that pleasure, our definition will evidently be a false one. But this is precisely what has occurred in the efforts to define art. Now, if we consider the food question, it will not occur to anyone to affirm that the importance of food consists in the pleasure we receive when eating it. Everyone understands that the satisfaction of our taste cannot serve as a basis for our definition of the merits of food. And in the same way, beauty, or that which pleases us, can in no sense serve as the basis for the definition of art. Nor can a series of objects which afford us pleasure serve as the model of what art should be. To see the aim and purpose of art and the pleasure we get from it is like assuming that the purpose and aim of food is the pleasure derived when consuming it." End quote. So Tolstoy dispenses with both the contrived philosophical justifications that have been given for art up to this point, just as he dispenses with the matter-of-fact explanation that art is beauty and therefore art is pleasure. And in fact, we should leave the entire question of beauty aside, because that by its very nature will only see us concerned with the pleasurable forms of art. And just as the pleasure of eating is not the reason why we eat, the pleasure we get in art is not why we do it. It's not why we engage in it. And that is a very important distinction, because it separates art from mere entertainment, the way that we earlier separated the functional building from the work of fine architecture. The conclusion that Tolstoy eventually reaches is a profound one. Art is essentially a relationship, and one that could be comparable to speech. One might be tempted to say that art is a language, but it would be more precise to say that art is a form of communication, and that language is simply a different form of communication. Art is the communication of emotion, of feeling, whereas speech, language, is useful for conveying information or knowledge. Tolstoy lays this out in a later chapter, quote, "Art is one of two organs of human progress. By words man interchanges thoughts. By the forms of art he interchanges feelings, and this with all men, not only of the present time, but also of the past and the future. It is natural to human beings to employ both these organs of intercommunication, and therefore the perversion of either of them must cause evil results to the society in which it occurs." End quote. Now, this is not to say that these are pure, separate spheres of human activity. Art can certainly convey information, and language can certainly convey emotion. But Tolstoy would argue that art, at least primarily, is the human activity by which we transmit feelings, just as language is at least primarily the activity by which we convey knowledge. And whenever we wish for language to convey feeling, we have to be a bit artful about it. And whenever we want art to convey information, it has to sort of incorporate wordiness, right? It has to be a form of art that includes information in some way or another. And if we reconsider art from this angle, realizing that this is its true function, that this is the true value of art, we will end up approaching the question, what is art, very, very differently from the one who sees art as an exercise in giving beauty or in giving pleasure or as mere leisure. Tolstoy writes in part 4, quote, "Every work of art causes the receiver to enter into a certain kind of relationship, both with him who produced or is producing the art, and with all those who simultaneously, previously, or subsequently receive the same artistic impression. Speech, transmitting the thoughts and experiences of men, serves as a means of union among them, and art acts in a similar manner. The peculiarity of this latter means of intercourse, distinguishing it from intercourse by means of words, consists in this, that whereas by words a man transmits his thoughts to another, by means of art he transmits his feelings. The activity of art is based on the fact that a man, receiving through his sense of hearing or sight another man's expression of feeling, is capable of experiencing the emotion which moved the man to express it. To take the simplest example, one man laughs and another who hears becomes merry, or a man weeps and another who hears feels sorrow. A man is excited or irritated, and another man, seeing him, comes to a similar state of mind. By his movements or by the sounds of his voice, a man expresses courage and determination, or sadness and calmness, and this state of mind passes on to others. A man suffers, expressing his sufferings by groans and spasms, and this suffering transmits itself to other people. A man expresses his feeling of admiration, devotion, fear, respect, or love to certain objects, persons, or phenomena, and others are infected by the same feelings of admiration, devotion, fear, respect, or love to the same objects, persons, and phenomena. And it is on this capacity of man to receive another man's expression of feeling and experience those feelings himself that the activity of art is based. If a man infects another or others directly, immediately, by his appearance, or by the sounds he gives vent to, at the very same time he experiences the feeling, if he causes another man to yawn when he himself cannot help yawning, or to laugh or cry when he himself is obliged to laugh or cry, or to suffer when he himself is suffering, that does not amount to art. Art begins when one person, with the object of joining another or others to himself in one and the same feeling, expresses that feeling by certain external indications." End quote. So for Tolstoy, and I think this is very explanatory, art is carried on or built on the foundation of these structures of gesture and facial expression, nonverbal communication, we might say, non-linguistic communication, because we might imagine a cry as something verbalized or a laugh as something, there is like a sonic expression there, but there's no intelligible linguistic meaning being conveyed. It's purely an emotional meaning. And we all know that this exists. We all know that human beings have the capacity to transmit emotion in this way, to reveal our inner emotional state, and even infect others, as Tolstoy puts it, with our emotional state through these nonverbal, non-linguistic forms of communication. And Tolstoy makes a distinction between them. He says that's not in itself art. The fact that you yawn when you can't help yawning, and it makes me yawn, that is the transmission of a feeling, in this case, I guess fatigue or something like that. Or we might say that, just the general cheerfulness that will be created, the mirth that will be created if you're in a room full of people who are smiling and laughing versus the mood that you will take on if you go into, say, the wake of a funeral. You will be in a very different emotional state of mind just by being surrounded by this, the nonverbal communication, the gestures, the facial expressions of others, by the emotional transference that's going on. That is not in itself art. But art it operates along those same lines. The reason why art is able to function, the reason why art is able to work, to transmit, to infect emotions, is because it's carried on that same structure or operates in that same way. But the key point is that understanding of art is communication. And Tolstoy will elaborate on the nuances of this understanding as we go on, but in rough outline, this is This is his insight into the nature of art, and I have not found a better one. And as I mentioned before, this was precisely the nature of my own insight into art as I self-reflected on it and what I was doing in making art, that art is communication, and that it's communication of emotion rather than a narrative or rather than a syllogistic form of knowledge or something like that. And it actually stands to reason that we should possess some sort of capacity for expressing emotion, right? That why would it make any sense for human beings when we have both an emotional life and an intellectual life to only be able to communicate in terms of the intellectual form of communication, in terms of language? That wouldn't make any sense, especially given that the conscious apparatus and that the linguistic mode of thought that characterizes conscious human life is a relatively recent innovation in the natural world. It always struck me as naive to think that communication ought to begin with speech or with the written word, given the communal and social nature of the human species. And there were some German philologists, among them Hermann Usner, who put forward the idea that the earliest myths and rituals were pre-linguistic, and that in fact language itself may have emerged from myth and ritual, which would mean that the earliest religious expressions, the earliest human expressions, period, would be artistic in nature, the attempt to convey or commune on the level of emotion, and that the linguistic system for communicating information is built on top of that emotional system, so to speak. And it shouldn't really trouble us that the raw material that art works with is not emotion itself, for whatever that would mean, but some sort of symbolic, externalized expression that somehow signifies the emotion. Because, after all, the same is true of language, isn't it? A word concept it's a sound made that somehow conveys an image or a concept. So, we're not dealing with the noumenon directly here. We have a sense experience, which we then represent to ourselves in our mind, and then attempt to somehow convey that represented experience through a sound utterance. That is language, right? And this is certainly a mysterious process to some extent, still, that philosophers of language have debated for years. But my point here is there's no special problem involved in the designation of art as a form of emotional communication, insofar as art isn't, the direct empathic sharing of emotions or something like that. Somehow human beings manage to incarnate a feeling through line, form, image, sound, whatever the case may be. And just as the value of humanity's ability to share its thoughts, to communicate information is manifest to us, insofar as we are social animals and we desire to know one another and share knowledge with one another, there's a manifest value in sharing emotion and communing on the level of emotion. And Tolstoy uses the word infects here to describe art. He says that the artist, through whatever his artistic means, communicates his feeling to another. And I do mean the connotation of the word communicate here in the sense of like a communicable disease. And we have to think of Socrates and the arguments he advances concerning art in The Republic and in Ion. In both of those dialogues, Socrates presents art as a form of mimesis. Particularly, Socrates speaks about plays and poetry and music and the ability of these art forms to transmit emotions across whole masses of human beings. Socrates' great concern is that bad art or counterproductive or immoral art may gain purchase and transmit itself uncontrollably across the city, and so the ideal city-state that he's trying to build would have to regulate art and ensure that only good art is allowed to propagate. And what he means by bad art, he makes clear. It's art that makes you gloomy or depressed or given to madness, or art that is inappropriate for your station in life. The soldiers can't be allowed to listen to music that will make them wistful and dreamy. They should listen to music with a martial quality that will make them excited for battle, right? Again, the reason I bring all of this up is because this mimetic view of art is precisely what Tolstoy expresses here in this essay. He uses the language of infection, which may have a negative connotation, but Tolstoy is not a critic of art in the same way that Socrates is. He thinks this is a social good, the justification that art can make in its own defense, as for the value it provides, and the reason why labor and human striving and effort ought to be sacrificed to it. And Tolstoy will later go on to outline how he basically believes that in earlier societies we had more of a universal art, where art was truly the thing that would bring the entire community, the entire society together. It was sort of culturally binding. And one of his big problems with art today is the way that it has fractionated. But we'll get to that in a little bit. An interesting point is that Tolstoy acknowledges this similarity between himself and Socrates. He says, the ancients, at least to some extent, shared this view of mine, in a way that Tolstoy is saying, I am simply remembering information that we've forgotten as a species or something like that. But this knowledge in the past led them in many cases to repudiate art. And he gives the example of Socrates. He also talks about Plato and Muhammad, and also the extremely orthodox, restrictive, rigid forms of Buddhism and Christianity. And Tolstoy says that such people who think that all art is bad and need to be controlled are simply wrong. They're correct about the power of art. They're correct about the mimetic quality of art. But they're mistaken in seeing art as inherently dangerous or something of that nature. Tolstoy writes, quote, people viewing art in this way, in contradiction to the prevalent view of today, which regards any art as good if it only affords pleasure, consider that art, as contrasted with speech, which need not be listened to, is so highly dangerous in its power to infect people against their wills that mankind will lose far less by banishing all art than by tolerating each and every art. Evidently, such people were wrong in repudiating all art, for they denied that which cannot be denied, one of the indispensable means of communication, without which mankind could not exist. But not less wrong are the people of civilized European society of our class and day in favoring any art if it but serves beauty, i.e., gives people pleasure, end quote. So the two extremes, Tolstoy is following the middle way here of acknowledging the power of art, and actually he will later in the essay put forward his standard of determining good from bad art, or determining true from false art, which many people in the modern world, with our endless subjectivity and relativism, are very loath to do. So he's willing to do that, which sort of, he's willing to say that art ought to serve some function beyond mere subjective pleasure or mere entertainment. But he also is not willing to go along with the people who repudiate all art and say that it all has to be banished. Famously in when ISIS took over some regions in the Middle East, they rounded up all the musical instruments and destroyed them. All musical instruments. We're not talking about electric guitars and hip-hop and DJs and stuff. We're talking about you can't have a freaking lute, something they've had since the Middle Ages, right? None of that. You can have a lone male voice singing the call to prayer, and that's about it, right? Tolstoy is also against that. The most succinct statement of this new view of art that Tolstoy attempts to promote, of a positive vision of art as mimesis, and one which joins mankind together, and an essential form of communication, that is found a bit further down in the same section, where Tolstoy writes, quote, to evoke in oneself a feeling one has once experienced, and having evoked it in oneself then by means of movements, lines, colors, sounds, or forms expressed in words, so to transmit that feeling, that others may experience the same feeling. This is the activity of art. Art is a human activity, consisting in this, that one man consciously, by means of certain external signs, hands on to others feelings he has lived through, and that other people are infected by these feelings and also experience them. Art is not, as the metaphysicians say, the manifestation of some mysterious idea of beauty or God. It is not, as the aesthetical physiologists say, a game in which man lets off his excess of stored-up energy. It is not the expression of man's emotions by external signs. It is not the product of pleasing objects, and above all, it is not pleasure. But it is a means of union among men, joining them together in the same feelings, and indispensable for the life and progress towards well-being of individuals and of humanity, end quote. So, as if he's the mirror image of Socrates, Tolstoy comes to that understanding of art as communicable, but unlike Socrates, who regards art with suspicion and as a thing to be controlled and regulated, Tolstoy says that art is indispensable for human life and indispensable for progress. And that's certainly a grandiose claim, but remember what it is that Tolstoy is attempting to justify here. He's saying if we conscript human beings to the task of spending their lives moving stones to build a cathedral, or if we take money from the public coffers that everyone's paid into in order to pay all these laborers needed to build an opera house, and all the money that's needed to put on the productions there, really these massive expenditures of human capital, which you could argue we've been engaged in since the time of the Great Pyramids and before that, we ought to have a really, really good explanation for what we are doing, why we're doing this. And Tolstoy's explanation is, this is the communion between man and man. This is a means of union amongst men. We all live in our own little subjectivity, and this is the way that we leap across that chasm and unite with one another. This is how we realize the brotherhood amongst men, through art. Now, whether we believe that art has such a grandiose place in the destiny of mankind as all that, I think it's hard to argue with the underlying insight that what we really want out of art is to feel something. But what does that mean? That, to say, that made me feel something. Where did the feeling come from? Out of the ether? No, it came from another human being. It came out of the heart of the artist, so to speak. And so art is this kind of relationship, this conversation between the artist and the audience. And we all want that. In the same way we all want friendships, we all want familial relationships, or in the grandest scale, a sense that we're part of something greater than ourselves, either for a religion or for our nation or for all humanity. Most people experience this as a real need. So whether art is actually that force that will deliver us to the pure state of, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and so forth, I think at the very least, it's clear that we experience it as a need, and this is, put simply, the need to commune our emotions with others, to experience someone else's feeling, to see new dimensions of feelings and the experiences of a feeling through the perception of others, to know that someone else feels the same thing that you've felt, or to transmit your own feeling through your own creative endeavors, so that people in the future know how you felt. That's art to Tolstoy. It's in the 6th chapter that Tolstoy puts forward some rather fascinating observations about art and the moral and social relationship to it that I think will be of particular interest to Nietzscheans, because on the one hand, Tolstoy makes many points that will be familiar to anyone who has read Nietzsche and which will seem quite in keeping with Nietzsche's perspective. But at the same time, over the course of his inquiry, he turns about and gives a very different conclusion from that of Nietzsche. Tolstoy writes, quote, "The estimation of the value of art, i.e. of the feelings it transmits, depends on men's perception of the meaning of life, depends on what they consider to be the good and the evil of life. And what is good and what is evil is defined by what are termed religions," end quote. A very Nietzschean point in many ways. The value of art is tied to what we think about the value of life, and therefore what we think is good in life, and what we conversely think is evil in life. Tolstoy continues, quote, "If the religion places the meaning of life in worshiping one God and fulfilling what is regarded as his will, as was the case among the Jews, then the feelings flowing from love to that God and to his law, successfully transmitted through the art of poetry by the prophets, by the Psalms, or by the epic of the book of Genesis, is good high art. All opposing that, as for instance the transmission of feelings of devotion to strange gods, or of feelings incompatible with the law of God, would be considered bad art. Or if, as was the case among the Greeks, the religion places the meaning of life in earthly happiness, in beauty and in strength, then art successfully transmitting the joy and energy of life would be considered good art, but art which transmitted feelings of effeminacy or despondency would be bad art. If the meaning of life is seen in the well-being of one's nation, or in honoring one's ancestors and continuing the mode of life led by them, as was the case among the Romans and the Chinese respectively, then art transmitting feelings of joy at sacrificing one's personal well-being for the common weal, or at exalting one's ancestors and maintaining their traditions, would be considered good art. but art expressing feelings contrary to this would be regarded as bad. If the meaning of life is seen in freeing oneself from the yoke of animalism, as is the case among the Buddhists, then art successfully transmitting feelings that elevate the soul and humble the flesh will be good art, and all that transmits feelings strengthening the bodily passions will be bad art." End quote. We're going to skip a bit further down, then continue. Quote, "The Christianity of the first centuries recognized as productions of good art only legends, lives of saints, sermons, prayers, and hymn singing, evoking love of Christ, emotion at his life, desire to follow his example, renunciation of worldly life, humility, and the love of others, all productions transmitting feelings of personal enjoyment they considered to be bad, and therefore rejected. For instance, tolerating plastic representations only when they were symbolical. They rejected all the pagan sculptures. This was so among the Christians of the first centuries who accepted Christ's teaching, if not quite in its true form, at least not in the perverted paganized form in which it was accepted subsequently. But besides this Christianity, from the time of the wholesale conversion of nations by order of the authorities, as in the days of Constantine, Charlemagne, and Vladimir, there appeared another, a church Christianity, which was nearer to paganism than to Christ's teaching. And this church Christianity, in accordance with its own teaching, estimated quite otherwise the feelings of people and the productions of art which transmitted those feelings. This church Christianity not only did not acknowledge the fundamental and essential positions of true Christianity, the immediate relationship of each man to the Father, the consequent brotherhood and equality of all men, and the substitution of humility and love in place of every kind of violence, but on the contrary, having set up a heavenly hierarchy similar to the pagan mythology, and having introduced the worship of Christ, of the Virgin, of angels, of apostles, of saints, and of martyrs, and not only of these divinities themselves, but also of their images, it made blind faith in the Church and its ordinances the essential point of its teaching." End quote. So, to consider the entirety of what we just read from that long section of Tolstoy's essay, his characterization of the value system of the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, the Jews, the Christians, it actually sounds very Nietzschean, right? He agrees with Nietzsche on the fundamental point that the Greek religion, the Greek tablet of values that determined their good and their evil, located the good in the earthly life, in the physical. The value is in earthly happiness, and therefore in beauty and in strength, whereas the Christian way of being is the renunciation of worldly happiness, the love of God or of Christ, which dwell not on earth but in heaven. The good art for the Christian is that which directs his eye towards those things, toward the desire to follow the example of Christ, which is the ascetic, world-denying life. The way in which Tolstoy differs starkly from Nietzsche is the same way in which he might be seen as similar to, or to anticipate the insights of, René Girard, who recognized the truth of Nietzsche's dichotomy of Dionysus versus the crucified, that this is an irreconcilable difference between the pagan value system and the value system of Christianity. But Girard takes up for the side of Christianity against Nietzsche, who took up for the side of Dionysus. And most importantly, Girard repudiated Nietzsche for placing ressentiment and the bad conscience, products, arguably, of the Christian slave morality, that Nietzsche placed these as the ultimate evil and the degeneration, the corruption of man. Girard, on the other hand, argued that the real corruption of mankind was the fact that the values of the pagan cults of worldly pleasure and physical beauty and strength and violence and so on had actually not really been destroyed, but merely weakened, that it had been somewhat suppressed, maybe it went underground, that mankind is essentially pagan. This is the nature of our sinfulness. And Christianity is a kind of ideal that perhaps, we at least have the image of it. We can at least strive for it, but we have not reached it, and arguably will never reach it. And so, along the same lines, Tolstoy argues, the real corruption of Western civilization is not that its paganism was poisoned with Christianity, but rather that true Christianity was poisoned with paganism, that the church hierarchy is an essentially pagan and worldly thing, The problem for Tolstoy is that Christianity has been paganized, that we can't see it for what it really is, or what it is supposed to be, a means of reaching that universal brotherhood of man, a truly pacifist religion. And if Christianity was understood in that pure form, then Christians would not have such a fear of art as such. They wouldn't have such a blind faith. They wouldn't be as inclined, perhaps, to iconoclasm, or, on the other side of that coin, towards this obsessive worship of the divine image as part of this paganized hierarchy. And so what Tolstoy is attempting to do with this essay is really a kind of religious mission, because the true Christian ought to see that art itself is this means of communication, this means of communion between man, and between man and God, therefore. We have to remember what Christ says in the Gospels, that where there are 2 or 3 of you gathered in my name, I am there with you. So the communion between man and man, this breaking down of separateness between those created in God's image, is itself joining together with God. So we can see how Tolstoy has the same, yet an opposite perspective to Nietzsche regarding the nature of paganism and Christianity. But the broader point is that, he's elucidating for us why it is art has always been seized upon, controlled, regulated by religions and social and political orders. And it's because we recognize, implicitly or otherwise, that art has a real power. It has that power of emotional mimesis. And thus, if there are some sentiments or some values or some feelings that we regard as evil, religion legislates against that. It legislates against any art that could promote those feelings. And so there's always this relationship between art and morality. Every aesthetic is also an ethic, as Wittgenstein put it, or we might say a bit more long-windedly, every aesthetic is inevitably bound to ethical concerns. Tolstoy's own ethical concern regarding art is primarily the fact that he believes that the broader culture has lost a sense for the true meaning of art. Tolstoy's criticism is as much directed at the church and its creeds, the church Christianity, as he calls it, which he believes has misconstrued the true meaning of Christ's teaching. He takes aim as much at them as he does at the upper classes, the elites, who, in his time, as in centuries previously, are those who are the primary patrons of the arts. They're the connoisseurs and the critics of the arts, and they're the ones throwing galas or attending operas, viewing paintings in galleries, and so on. While access to art and the ability to make art is a fair bit more distributed these days, I would say the situation is still more or less the same, that the art world is dominated by money, as it always has been, and it's dominated by people of high status. And Tolstoy believes that this very state of affairs means that we've lost the sense of what art is. Art, in its true form, is liberatory in some way. I mean, as Tolstoy has laid the case out, it ultimately guides us toward the essence of Christianity, or at least it should. Tolstoy sees the original aim of art as being truly universal, and one of the ways of talking about the artistic malaise is that it is a sundering of art. We might think of the way that music has evolved in our own time, or just across the modern era. So, we begin with these styles rooted in Western music theory that predominated for centuries, and there's sort of like almost a universal sort of symphonic music culture. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, folk music becomes more popular. And then we invent radio, and suddenly all these genres begin to appear. And then over the decades, subgenres, and then subgenres of subgenres of subgenres, as is the situation today. And the result is that the public engagement with music is now fractionated, such that, if I'm over here making heavy metal music, people who aren't into that subgenre of, rock and roll, as you might see it, might have absolutely no knowledge of the subgenre whatsoever, no engagement with it. It's completely separate from their world, and the same too, of somebody over here making country and Western music that I have no engagement with, and that has it's not resonating with me. It's not infecting me with any kinds of feelings. We're not engaging with one another, right? These forms of art have become fractionated, which simply means they're not universal. Now, why is that a problem? It might be hard for us to understand from our modern mindset why that's even a problem. I think it's comprehensible why it is. If we consider the movement of artists, which was also a kind of a social movement of the upper classes that produced the type of person known as a decadent. And obviously the term decadent has like a general meaning, but there was a class of people in the 19th centuries who, a movement among the upper classes that were called decadents. And you might think of people like Lord Byron. I mean, live fast, die young, leave a beautiful corpse, right, is sort of the attitude. We're the drunken wastrel children of the elites who live a life of leisure, and we're going to suck the marrow out of that life, to use the language of the Dead Poets Society, right? And Tolstoy has some harsh words about them. Quote, "Mark this above all. If only it be admitted that art may be art, and yet be unintelligible to anyone of sound mind, there is no reason why any circle of perverted people should not compose works tickling their own perverted feelings and comprehensible to no one but themselves, and call it art, as is actually being done by the so-called decadents," end quote. So Tolstoy is saying they make art for themselves or the people in their milieu, and they don't really care about whether anyone in the outside world really comprehends it or gets anything out of it. This may seem like something of an odd point to fixate on, but I think if we recenter, go back to the foundation of Tolstoy's thesis here, that art is a form of communication, then we will reconsider this problem as akin to, we could analogize to a language disintegrating into a bunch of mutually incomprehensible dialects spoken by smaller and smaller groups of people and subgroups within those groups. From Tolstoy's perspective, the situation with art is like an emotional corollary to that, really to the story of the Tower of Babel. And while it may be more of our inclination in the modern age to celebrate the diversity and the variety of art, I think what Tolstoy is really getting at is something about which I think most modern people will actually find common cause. And for Tolstoy, this problem isn't really about the fact that different styles of artistic expression exist. The problem, really, that the red thread that runs throughout this document is elitism. That's one of Tolstoy's main problems. The problem is these little artistic subcommunities that claim exclusive understanding or exclusive communion with their own little subgenre of art, and claim that outsiders don't really get it. This kind of elitism in Tolstoy's time, I mean, it is a literal kind of elitism because it's the artistic presumptions of the social and economic and political elite that they're the only ones who really understand art, and that as the true connoisseurs, they stand above the comprehension of the common people. But I think we can see this kind of elitism, again, let's use musical subgenres as an example. Today, we would usually call it gatekeeping. Oftentimes, people like their little fringe exclusive genre, but it becomes a club that you're a part of. And then people start to enjoy the fact that the broader public doesn't like it or doesn't know about it or doesn't get it. And this was and is still very common in the punk rock world, for example, where you can find this in some metal subgenres like in black metal. And the old elitist form of this mindset, I would argue, is also still alive and well. I mean, it exists in any Brooklyn art gallery, right? The literal kind of elitism. But the point is, it's like the people who, it's not just that there's a diversity of art, it's that Tolstoy's real problem is with people who try to have this insular gatekeeping little community around their form of artistic expression, which he says completely misses the point, completely fails to understand what art is. So Tolstoy writes, quote, "The fact that I am accustomed to a certain exclusive art and can understand it, but am unable to understand another still more exclusive art, does not give me a right to conclude that my art is the real true art, and that the other one which I do not understand is an unreal, a bad art. I can only conclude that art, becoming ever more and more exclusive, has become more and more incomprehensible to an ever-increasing number of people, and that, in this, its progress towards greater and greater incomprehensibility, on one level of which I am standing, with the art familiar to me, it has reached a point where it is understood by a very small number of the elect, and the number of these chosen people is ever becoming smaller and smaller. As soon as ever the art of the upper classes separated itself from universal art, a conviction arose that art may be art and yet be incomprehensible to the masses. And as soon as this position was admitted, it had inevitably to be admitted also that art may be intelligible only to the very smallest number of the elect, and eventually to two or to one of our nearest friends, or to oneself alone, which is practically what is being said by modern artists. I create and understand myself, and if anyone does not understand me, so much the worse for him. End quote. So I think it's easy to see what's intuitive and elegant about Tolstoy's explanation of art, that art is a form of communication, of the mimesis of feeling. I think that makes a lot of intuitive sense out of art. And again, that's the theory behind my own book, so of course I'm biased here. But the flip side of that perspective on art is that it doesn't really make sense in light of that to say, I just do art for me. And some people do say that their art is just for themselves, and damn what the audience thinks. We just do art for that special elect, right? Those of us in the know, those who are part of the avant-garde, the cool people who really get modern art or postmodern art. And Tolstoy would say, to the extent that you're engaged in that, you're just being a self-absorbed decadent. You're not using art for what it's really meant to be. You're abusing art. It's just a narcissistic form of self-expression, masturbatory form of self-expression that you nevertheless claim most people won't understand, or that you don't even care if they understand. But really the entire point of art is to communicate feeling. It's to make other people understand. So the real problem with the modern artist is precisely this self-absorption and forgetting the nature of the artistic work as essentially communicative. On the other hand, there's a bigger problem at work in the broader culture, which might almost be considered as the inverse of the purely self-absorbed artist. And that is the artistic manipulator, the one whose art is not self-absorbed, but we might say totally other-absorbed, the one who gives nothing of himself but only wishes to manipulate appearances in order to capture as many hearts as possible, or capture as many wallets as possible in many cases. Tolstoy's main focus of critique in this part of the essay is his attack on counterfeit art. Counterfeit art is created cynically. It's not a true expression of one's inner emotional content. Counterfeit art is the attempt to reverse engineer those tones or lines or forms that will produce a certain emotional content and seek to create that emotional response without regard for whether there's actually a real communion happening. And so in Tolstoy's understanding, this is actually a very important nuance in that he separates the art from the technique used to make it. In some sense, they have very little to do with one another, you could even say. As little as the rules of grammar and syntax and spelling and punctuation have to do with, say, the themes and characters and the story of The Great Gatsby, right? You can't get one strictly from the other. Without those functional rules, without a command over language, over the techniques of writing, without a proficiency in writing, you can't write the story at all. But you will never assemble a story simply from a knowledge of the rules of writing, if that makes sense. The art, the story, the content is drawn from one's inner world, from their own experience in life, and from their feelings, and from the fact that presumably they have something to say. And so Tolstoy criticizes the idea that one could learn the techniques of poetry, go to school and study the great poets, get a knack for writing lines and verses, and thereby become a poet. Because where poetry comes from is antecedent to all of those things, and in some way transcends all of those things. And Tolstoy goes down the line of various different artistic disciplines and says in each of these fields, the counterfeits are ready to hand because they are produced by a ready-made formula. And we might counter that Tolstoy's problem is simply with imitation, right? All artists have to engage in imitation in order to learn their craft in the first place, but Tolstoy would say, learning the craft is not the same thing as producing art, right? Producing true art. And that, in fact, imitation is one of the traits that he says does constitute counterfeit art. We may have to learn by imitation, learn the technique, but the goal in learning, the goal in acquiring that artistic proficiency, is for the very purpose of going beyond imitating. And if you consider the example again of a musician who never gets beyond their influences, continues to sound exactly like their favorite band, the band that inspired them to start playing, 10 years later they still sound exactly like that same band. Most of us would say they never graduated to making real art, right? They remain imitators. And there is a negative connotation to say that someone is a mere imitator, even if we acknowledge, yeah, you go to art school and you learn to draw or you learn to paint, you are going to imitate the greats. But that's, again, it's a foundation. It's not the essence of art. It's like learning the rules of writing, but it doesn't get you to the place of actually practicing writing as an art form. And so if you remain an imitator, you're in some sense a false artist if you're not a true artist. And so Tolstoy writes, quote, "Many conditions must be fulfilled to enable a man to produce a real work of art. It is necessary that he should stand on the level of the highest life conception of his time, that he should experience feeling and have the desire and capacity to transmit it, and that he should moreover have a talent for some one of the forms of art. But in order, aided by the customary methods of borrowing, imitating, introducing effects, and interesting, unceasingly to produce counterfeits of art, which pass for art in our society and are well paid for, it is only necessary to have a talent for some branch of art, and this is very often to be met with. By talent, I mean ability. In literary art, the ability to express one's thoughts and impressions easily, and to notice and remember characteristic details. In the depictive arts, to distinguish and remember lines, forms, and colors. In music, to distinguish the intervals, and to remember and transmit the sequence of sounds. And a man in our times, if only he possesses such a talent and selects some specialty, may, after learning the methods of counterfeiting used in his branch of art, if he has patience, and if his aesthetic feeling, which would render such productions revolting to him, be atrophied, unceasingly, till the end of his life, turn out works which will pass for art in our society." End quote. So in order to really produce art, we need a number of conditions. Not only must one be able to use the technique to be proficient, right? That's perhaps the barest minimum of necessities, and it's necessary but not sufficient. One also must have the feeling inside of themselves and the desire to transmit it, and he should also, quote, "stand on the level of the highest life conception of his time," end quote. That's a bit more of an esoteric concern, and perhaps more of a concern with creating great art. But this means that art ought to be created in a kind of spiritual or philosophical alignment with the highest conception of life available to the artist. I mean, really, Tolstoy is suggesting that atavistic attempts at art, romantic attempts to capture past styles or speak with the voice of past eras, do not rise to the level of truly great art. And that might make you wonder, I mean, would Tolstoy have criticism for the Weimar classicists, for example, those Germans like Goethe who attempted to recapture the Hellenic spirit? And of course, Tolstoy does have a critical word for Goethe. He thinks Goethe is someone who borrowed and imitated. Almost everything in the Faust play is borrowed from some earlier source, the ideas, the characters, even whole scenes. But borrowing and imitating are not the only ways to produce counterfeit art. Another way would be attempting to create striking scenes, striking images or sounds, or to produce that which is interesting or novel. Tolstoy listed those out in the section we read above: imitating, borrowing, creating what is striking, and trying to interest the audience. The main target when it comes to artificially creating that which is striking or novel would be Richard Wagner. And I don't want to give the impression earlier, by the way, that Goethe is a counterfeit artist, because Tolstoy still counts Goethe among the great artists. But this is not the case with Wagner, whom he believes has artificially assembled a number of styles of art. He's combined music and poetry and all of these aspects into his Gesamtkunstwerk. Not only does Tolstoy believe that this combination is unnatural and negatively impacts each of the constituent parts of the work, but he likens Wagner to a kind of hypnotist or illusionist, or we might say magician, right? Playing upon the audience's emotions in an artificial or contrived manner. And this is a very similar critique to the one leveled by Nietzsche toward Wagner, who was his old mentor. Tolstoy devotes an entire chapter basically to attacking the music of Wagner. He even recounts attending performances of Wagner's work at Bayreuth and finding himself at odds with the crowds of people who seemed to swoon under the power of Wagner's music. And again, Wagner borrows from fairy tales. He borrows from all over the place for his characters and stories. He's perhaps the prime example of the counterfeit artist, which is very interesting from a Nietzschean perspective yet again, because Nietzsche, of course, begins as one under the sway of Wagner and, as we've said, comes to more or less share Tolstoy's perspective toward the end of his life. But even though Wagner is one of the worst offenders, it's not as if Wagner is the cause of any of this. He's simply an example of the kind of counterfeit artist that our society inevitably produces. And why? Well, Tolstoy explains why in very profound terms, I think. Quote, "In our society, three conditions cooperate to cause the production of objects of counterfeit art. They are, 1, the considerable remuneration of artists for their productions and the professionalization of artists which this has produced. 2, art criticism, and 3, schools of art. While art was as yet undivided, and only religious art was valued and rewarded, while indiscriminate art was left unrewarded, there were no counterfeits of art, or if any existed, being exposed to the criticism of the whole people, they quickly disappeared. But as soon as that division occurred, and the upper classes acclaimed every kind of art as good, if only it afforded them pleasure, and began to reward such art more highly than any other social activity, immediately a large number of people devoted themselves to this activity, and art assumed quite a different character and became a profession. And as soon as this occurred, the chief and most precious quality of art, its sincerity, was at once greatly weakened and eventually quite destroyed. The professional artist lives by his art and has continually to invent subjects for his works, and does invent them, and it is obvious how great a difference must exist between the works of art produced, on the one hand, by men such as the Jewish prophets, the authors of the Psalms, Francis of Assisi, the authors of the Iliad and Odyssey, of folk stories, legends, and folk songs, many of whom not only received no remuneration for their work, but did not even attach their names to it. And, on the other hand, works produced by court poets, dramatists, and musicians receiving honors and remuneration. And later on by professional artists who lived by the trade, receiving remuneration from newspaper editors, publishers, impresarios, and in general from those agents who come between the artist and the town public, the consumers of art. Professionalism is the first condition of the diffusion of false, counterfeit art." End quote. So money ruins everything, and art has become a profession, and so it's become driven by money. And as soon as professionalism becomes involved, it's all over for sincerity. I mean, it would be like introducing market forces into religion and expecting that this will somehow elevate the preacher with the most truthful and sincere message in his teaching, right? When in reality, we all know what actually happens is that it elevates the preacher with the flashiest presentation, or the most impressive presentation, the most emotionally manipulative message. And it's funny because here in America, we've actually seen that form of religion come into being. When I think about what Tolstoy might think about like a megachurch, I mean, I'm pretty sure he would roll in his grave. But the point is that art and religion for Tolstoy, they come from that same primal source, that authentic spiritual core of the human being. Art comes from the soul, if you will. And true art is always the sincere expression of the soul. Once art becomes a way of making money, you're sure to see some number of so-called artists, maybe even a majority, who are in it for the money. What else does he blame? Well, he says art critics, and we'll discuss that in a bit, but also schools of art. And that's somewhat in the same vein of his broader criticism that we considered before, that a school of art teaches you technique. It teaches you to borrow and imitate. It doesn't instill you with the capacity to sincerely transmit your feelings to the world. It teaches you how to look like an artist, right? To write like a poet, play like a musician, paint like a painter. And perhaps the most elegant way of making Tolstoy's point is that writing a poem doesn't make you a poet. Playing an instrument doesn't make you a musician. technique doesn't count one lick toward being a true artist. With the aim is to stand at the highest life conception of your time and sincerely convey your feeling with the greatest talent you can towards that aim, with the idea in mind that this is all aimed at that communion between man and man, that leaping over the chasm between subjectivities. And the point he makes here is brilliant. Homer didn't go study at university to learn to write the Odyssey. The authors of the Psalms weren't being paid. These treasures of human artistic achievement occurred without any monetary incentive, without any formal training, and without the pretensions of different genres or schools of thought of art, without the guidance of art critics. Tolstoy has nothing but savage words for art critics. It's one of my favorite aspects of this essay, although there are so many favorite aspects I can hardly choose. But the art critics misunderstand what art is in a rather fundamental way, through their very presumption to analyze and explain and make judgments about art on that intellectual level, which Tolstoy would say is just flat out wrong from the start. Tolstoy writes, quote, "A friend of mine, speaking of the relation of critics to artists, half-jokingly defined it thus: critics are the stupid who discuss the wise. However partial, inexact, and rude this definition may be, it is yet partly true, and is incomparably juster than the definition which considers critics to be men who can explain works of art. Critics explain. What do they explain? The artist, if a real artist, has by his work transmitted to others the feeling he experienced. What is there, then, to explain? If a work be good as art, then the feeling expressed by the artist, be it moral or immoral, transmits itself to other people. If transmitted to others, then they feel it, and all interpretations are superfluous. If the work does not infect people, no explanation can make it contagious. An artist's work cannot be interpreted. Had it been possible to explain in words what he wished to convey, the artist would have expressed himself in words. He expressed it by his art, only because the feeling he expressed could not be otherwise transmitted. The interpretation of works of art by words only indicates that the interpreter is himself incapable of feeling the infection of art. And this is actually the case, for, however strange it may seem to say so, critics have always been people less susceptible than other men to the contagion of art. For the most part, they are able writers, educated and clever, but with their capacity of being infected by art quite perverted or atrophied, and therefore their writings have always largely contributed and still contribute to the perversion of the taste of that public which reads them and trusts them. Artistic criticism did not exist, could not, and cannot exist in societies where art is undivided, and where, consequently, it is appraised by the religious understanding of life common to the whole people. Art criticism grew and could grow only on the art of the upper classes who did not acknowledge the religious perception of their time." End quote. So once again, Tolstoy in his critique invokes this notion of the originally universal or undivided art. Not that all art was the same, but we might say a state of being, a state of culture in which art was not confined within certain expert disciplines or schools of thought, when there was no critic, no so-called expert class who was tasked with interpreting and judging art. Everyone is allowed to judge for himself. The zeitgeist as a whole takes stock of the culture's art and becomes judge of what is great in a kind of superordinate sense. The entire profession of art criticism for Tolstoy is an effect of this elitism, this fractionation of art, this retreat of the upper classes into a decadent subculture, into self-absorbed forms of expression, and this pretension of having a special understanding that the average person doesn't have access to. And we can see this happening in the modern art world today, when someone tapes a banana to the wall and the vast majority of people say, "That's stupid." And then an art critic comes along to tell them, "Well, you just don't understand how brilliant this really is," right? Because after all, you don't have the university education. You don't have the training in art criticism to comprehend the powerful statement being made, or whatever the case may be. And this is a very important difference in Tolstoy's conception of art from that of, say, Nietzsche. Tolstoy, as you must have gathered by this point, is a resolute anti-elitist. And he says that the unsophisticated rural peasant type, the salt of the earth people, even without having any formal education or training, in general, they still have a good sense for what good art really is. That a down-to-earth person with no intellectual or elitist pretensions can read the Odyssey and comprehend they're reading a great work. And that these timeless works endure because we leave it up to the zeitgeist. That in the long term, the true works of art are what will survive. And it's only in these insular little communities, among decadents, or in the opinion columns of art critics, that these counterfeit works manage to seduce people, or these forms of expression which defy popular opinion. In the end, all of these counterfeit works are going to be washed away in the waves of time, we might say. Most importantly, the critic is not infected. He's not carried away. He's not driven out of his mind by the work of art. He is not made to feel what the artist feels. If he were, then his art criticism would be superfluous. And this is the real irony here, that the critic is perhaps the least artistic mind around, the type of mind who can experience art and then have the impulse to intellectualize it and analyze it, take it and turn it into themes and subtext and so on. For art criticism to really engage with art, it would actually have to itself be a work of art. And rarely, if ever, does art criticism rise to that level. The artist has already said everything that needs to be said, only he hasn't said it by language. As David Lynch put it, you'll ruin it by talking about it. The talking is up there on the screen. Tolstoy concludes his essay. He brings it home by returning to these themes of the religious nature of a truly universal art. The essence of his criticism of the upper classes is that they've ceased to be Christian. They've broken with the religious anchor for their experience of art. And Tolstoy wonders about the possibilities for art in the future. His focus is on returning to the truly religious essence of art. He says he wishes for art to be permeated by a truly Christian spirit, as he puts it. And that means art has to be aimed at the unification of man. And I think this is what is really meant when Tolstoy invokes the highest standpoint concerning life that's available to the artist at a given time. This is what Tolstoy thinks can really be perceived by the Christians of his time. We're now in a position to perceive the true essence of Christ's teaching: unity, brotherhood, equality, and love, as he lays it all out. And so the future that Tolstoy hopes for in art is one that he thinks could be facilitated by this very essay, right? The dawning awareness of the true nature of art, the repudiation of the false art that has hijacked our culture. Tolstoy writes, quote, "The religious perception of our time, which consists in acknowledging that the aim of life, both collective and individual, is the union of mankind, is already so sufficiently distinct that people have now only to reject the false theory of beauty, according to which enjoyment is considered to be the purpose of art, and religious perception will naturally take its place as the guide of the art of our time. As soon as the religious perception, which already unconsciously directs the life of man, is consciously acknowledged, then immediately and naturally the division of art into art for the lower and art for the upper classes will disappear. There will be one common, brotherly, universal art. And first, that art will naturally be rejected, which transmits feelings incompatible with the religious perception of our time, feelings which do not unite but divide men, and then that insignificant, exclusive art will be rejected, to which an importance is now attached, to which it has no right." End quote. Tolstoy spent a total of 15 years writing this essay. And we may again find cause to wonder why he would have spent so much of his time this way, given that he'd already produced his great works of art by this time. And is Tolstoy not being a bit overly intellectual himself about art and its aims? Couldn't one argue, according to his own reasoning set out in this essay, that all the arguments had already been made, so to speak, within Tolstoy's literary work? Well, Tolstoy argues that this essay is part of an attempt to create a science of art. And he sees no contradiction here. He says that the so-called theories about art up to this point have amounted to little more than a web of sophistries. But the self-consciousness of the true nature and aim of art can help us in achieving its true task. The art itself cannot be made, scientifically, so to speak. That would only be to engage in counterfeit art, right? To study the technique, the line, and forms in order to manipulate people, something like that. The real value of Tolstoy's words here to the artist is really to provide the artist with the means of distinguishing true art from false art, good art from bad art. And primarily the utility here is as regards oneself, right? To keep oneself on guard against falling into any of those traps, preventing oneself from becoming an imitator or someone who thinks that you have to deck out your work with impressive or novel aspects, that the point of art is to be provocative or striking, rather than, as Tolstoy would say, to be sincere. He's trying to anchor us to something, and he hopes that this will help us in rediscovering what true art is. In any case, this really matters because unlike many of us in the modern world who consider art to be unimportant, a form of mere entertainment or a distraction, Tolstoy considers art to have real power and to have a real task concerning the human destiny. And it is almost an unbelievable faith that he expresses in art's power. Remember, Tolstoy is a Christian pacifist, and while it might be almost impossible to conceive how one could create a world governed by such principles as those of pacifism, Tolstoy suggests here that we could very well accomplish such a thing, not through the familiar means, however, that are usually put forward, moral programs, political movements, and so on, but through art. That's how Tolstoy thinks you could actually realize Christianity on earth. He writes in the concluding section, quote, "The task of art is enormous. Through the influence of real art, aided by science, guided by religion, that peaceful cooperation of man which is now obtained by external means, by our law courts, police, charitable institutions, factory inspection, etc., should be obtained by man's free and joyous activity. Art should cause violence to be set aside, and it is only art that can accomplish this." End quote. So for Tolstoy, that's why this matters, and that's why he felt he had to write this essay, even after completing all of his great works, that it is not just that art can do something that all of these other spheres of human striving or endeavor could also do. Art's the only thing that can do it. Art is the force that can bring us to the true religious perception and essence, the true Christianity in Tolstoy's view. That's all for this week, everyone. And that's all for this leg of the season. If you've been following along, you know what we've been doing. But for the rest of you, this season is broken up into 3 sections, in between which we're covering The Gay Science by Nietzsche, doing a comprehensive walkthrough of that text. And so next week, we're hitting Book 3, which, that's where The Gay Science really turns into a banger at that point. The first 2 books are pretty good, but Book 3 is where it really takes off. And after that, we'll return for 8 more episodes of Season 5. So this season's kind of like interspersed with book walkthroughs. And after the season is over, that's when we'll do Book 4 of The Gay Science. So I've got a lot planned for the final leg of the season, a lot that I've been preparing for quite a long time. I'm very excited to finally get into the work of Erich Heller, Klosowski, Heidegger, and a couple others, and share my thoughts with all of you on some very fascinating works. It's been a hard couple of months for me, but I also have some very exciting things coming up in my life in the immediate future. My band is about to put out our 2nd album. It only took us about a year to make. And afterwards, I'm going to go tour in the West Coast, Western United States, for the first time with this new project, which I'm very excited about. I really can't wait to get out on the road again. And that's why it was really fitting to finally talk about Tolstoy in this essay that I really love. I think it's a wonderful note to end this stretch of Season 5 before we get back into The Gay Science. So thank you very much for joining me, everyone. Cheers. Much love from Austin, Texas. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.